G'day Virtual Pilots, it's Requiem. In today's video we're going to have a look at the Arado 234. So starting off from the back left here, there's some bomb sight controls. Up the top is your wind speed adjustment, and underneath that is going to be your target height adjustment. Below those is the contact altimeter. There's a separate video on my channel if you want to learn how to use that. Coming forward is your outside air temperature gauge, an exhaust nozzle control switch, the cockpit lighting, which is one of several around, the rocket assisted takeoff jettison button, as well as the takeoff panel which controls the rockets. So looking at the external view here, this is what's installed on the underside of each wing to give you that rocket boost. So you'll activate it and it'll help you have a shorter takeoff run, and these are jettisoned after takeoff. Coming back inside is the auxiliary fuel tank selector, 2 fuel cocks for the engines, and then there's rudder trim as well. Now in front of that is going to be your horizontal stabilizer trim. The triangle there indicates the neutral position. Pulling it back will give you nose up trim, and forward is nose down. Now on the throttles here is going to be a couple of red latches. If you move the throttles forward of them, this is going to be the fuel cutoff position, and the sim will prevent you from retracting them past that when the engines are running. Now next to that is the engine ignition. You got a light telling you when igniter is on, and you have igniters for engines 1 and 2. Moving forward, you've got an emergency power off switch, hydraulic pressure gauge, a gyro monitor switch. You got your autopilot channels when you activate the autopilot, an artificial horizon switch, target approach switch, the landing gear switch, the flaps controls, and the flap and landing gear position panel. Now the red handle is going to be your drogue chute deploy handle. So if you select the drogue chute as an option, it's put on the back of the aircraft here. This will help reduce your landing distance on shorter runways. Above that's your incidence indicator and the autopilot pitch control, as well as the autopilot master switch, and those will be used when you have the autopilot engaged. There's the drogue chute jettison handle, as well as the magnetic compass. And on the main instrument panel, you got your engine pressure ratio, which is the ratio of the air exiting the nozzle compared to the air entering the intake. Got an airspeed indicator, altimeter, an artificial horizon with a slip indicator, repeater compass, the vertical speed indicator, and the AFN2 homing indicator. Now these last 2 gauges are dual scale tachometers. So there's 2 scales. There's the inner scale, which reads between 0 and 3000 RPM. You'll use that during engine starts, and the outer scale will be what you use normally. So up above here, this is going to be the bombing computer with the periscope. This is something we'll look at after the engine starts. So back inside, you got some side mirrors on the right and the left. You use left Windows C, and that'll open and close these. It will increase the noise a little bit when they're open. You got a canopy jettison handle. Then over on the right, you got the oxygen regulator, as well as the main electrical panel, which has most of your buttons, an oxygen flow and pressure gauge, and the throttle starter motor panel, which has your RPM scale selector buttons. Up the front here, you got your left and right fuel pressure gauges and the bomb jettison handle. These are your oil pressure gauges, fire warning temperature gauges, exhaust gas temperature gauges, and your fuel quantity, as well as fuel warning lights. Now if you're going to do level bombing, you could select this bomb site to allow you to do that. But if you were going for a photo recon option, you can select that mod as well. That'll change what you see here, as well as install the cameras in the back of the aircraft, and that'll require some nose down trim on takeoff and landing. Alright, in the back right, we can get in position. It's a little bit wonky. This is your ignition control box, the bomb's control panel, the flaps and landing gear emergency selector, a frequency selector, formation lights, In the back, this is a lot of radio and IFF equipment, including a demolition switch for it. And if you had the photo recon installed, you would use the Bombay door key to open up the doors to use the photo recon. Alright, so now we'll look at how to start the engines here. These are the same engines you find on the Messerschmitt 262, so the startup procedure is identical. And we'll make sure we've got both engines selected, so we'll press number 1 and number 2, and then press the E key. This will bring power into the airplane and kick off the process. And you hear the right or starter motor begin. Then we look over at the scale on the left engine. And we're watching the inner scale for this. As it approaches 1000 RPM, going to get the left igniter running. And we press and hold it. You want to hold it during the entire startup sequence. So keep that held down, and then once you reach 2000 RPM, you can increase the throttle to get above that shutoff position, and then bring it up to 3000 RPM. And once it's stable, we can then release the engine igniter. And then the automated process is going to kick in for engine 2. So watching the inner scale, the needle's starting to come up. As it reaches 1000 RPM, turn on the igniter for engine number 2 and hold it. Now if you were to increase the throttle at this point as well, you would actually introduce fuel and cause an engine fire. So that's why we wait until we get past 2000 RPM. And once it crosses it, we'll increase the throttle past that cutoff point, get the throttle up to 3000 RPM and release the engine igniter for number 2, and the engine start process is completed. You see, got them set for 3000 RPM, and the engine instruments, everything's normal. So here we're going to close the canopy. And then you can review the pilot's notes for the Arado 234. Alright, now if we press left shift V, this will take us into the dive bombing site. This is pretty straightforward to use. You basically dive until the horizontal line is on the target where you release the bombs. I can show a demo later. If you press left Alt and M, that turns the lights for the site on and off. And if you press right Alt and F, that will take you to the periscope. And as you can see, that inverts the image. Alright, so now we're going to taxi. One thing you want to be careful of is how fast you move the throttle. So you want to be watching the exhaust gas temperature gauges, and how fast you move the throttle will determine like how fast the exhaust gas temperature increases. So as long as you adjust the throttle to a point where it doesn't go past 900 degrees, then you'll be okay. Get to over 6000 RPM, the plane will start rolling. It's obviously going to be weight dependent. For tighter turns, you'll probably need to use differential power. So you'd have to reduce the power in the left engine in this case. And you can use differential braking as well if you want to. Now the real operating notes for this airplane said that taxiing wasn't really recommended because the engines had a tendency to overheat, and they would actually tug the airplane out to the runway to minimize the time it was on the ground to prevent engines overheating. But in the sim, taxiing isn't a really big deal at all, so feel free to do it. Alright, so we'll move forward to the takeoff sequence. For taking off in the Arado, you'll set your takeoff trim according to the configuration. So from the neutral position, depending on what you have, you'll make those adjustments nose down accordingly, and you'll set the flaps for takeoff. For the takeoff technique, you basically hold in the brakes with 6,000 RPM, check the instruments, and you set 7,000, at which point you release the brakes and get max thrust. You use the rocket booster if you have it by using the R key, and you rotate about 200 to 210 kilometers per hour. Then you can jettison the boosters, retract the flaps, and climb out between 350 and 400 kilometers an hour. So trying to get ourselves lined up, you can use the differential thrust or the differential braking as needed to get yourself lined up straight. Apply the brakes in kind of a stop, bring the throttles back to idle, nice and slowly so you don't risk flaming the engines out. Now the rocket assisted takeoff panel will flick that switch forward, that's going to activate the boosters, and then for the stabilizer trim, it's going to set it to the neutral position because we have bombs, or a bomb, so it'll be at 0. Flaps, going to set them to takeoff. Verify that with the yellow lights. Holding the brakes, watching our temperatures, we increase the throttle up to 6,000 just to avoid the possibility of the engine fire. So as long as you keep that needle below 900, you'll be fine. So 6,000, everything's normal. So you can increase it to 7,000 RPM. Release the brakes and go full thrust. And you can activate the rocket booster and keep it straight on the runway using the rudder. Here we can see what the rocket booster looks like from the external view. So we're going to keep it nice and straight, using the rudder as needed. The plane may tilt a little bit, but that's not a big deal. It will sort itself out along the takeoff roll due to the suspension. Once you hit 200 to 10 kilometers an hour, start pulling back on the yoke, get the plane airborne. At a positive rate of climb, we'll get the gear up. I'm going to climb out between 220 to 250 kilometers per hour initially. Then the rocket boosters turn off, so we can jettison them. And the cool feature with these is they actually have a parachute attached to them. So after the boosters turn off and we jettison, they can be recovered and used again. Alright, so you've got to get above 250 kilometers per hour and retract the flaps. Don't retract the flaps below 250. You may sink a little bit, but that's okay. So allow yourself to gain the airspeed. You're going to climb out between 350 and 400 kilometers per hour. Now remember, this airplane does have an autopilot feature, so if you wanted to automate your climb, you can do that using the autopilot. So here we're going to have a look at the autopilot feature, coming down to the left. First we're going to turn the autopilot on using right Alt and A. Okay, now we need to engage the autopilot channels, roll, pitch and yaw with right Alt, R, P and Y. And so now you can use the right Alt and the arrow keys left and right. This will adjust your course left and right, and that's the control up on the yoke there on the top right. So if we do that to the left, the plane will begin changing heading to the left, and back to the right, the plane will change heading back to the right. Like I mentioned, if you wanted to automate that climb, you can set a pitch angle, and we note what the pitch angle is using the incidence indicator here. So right now this is telling us that our incidence indicator is at 0. So if we use the right Alt arrow keys up and down, this is going to change our incidence to increase our pitch angle. So if I raise the nose, just tap the key or button, whatever you're using. If I set 5 degrees nose up, that's going to be a good climb angle to use for this airplane. And we can see, based on that incidence indicator, and you can see the full triangle with that little gap, that's about 5 degrees. So if you weren't using the Techno Chat, that's where your 5 degrees is going to be. You can set higher, of course, but this is going to result in a much more drastic kind of speed bleed off. So it's up to you how you want to use it. So coming back to the field, we'll look at landing the Arado. You're going to set your throttle to 5,000 RPM. Airspeed, we're going to get that below 350 kilometers per hour, at which point you'll extend the landing gear. The airspeed will drop due to the extra drag between 320 and 250 kilometers per hour. And the flaps, you can set the takeoff position at that point. The airplane will want to change its pitch attitude, so you need to adjust that accordingly. And you'll fly a base to final turn between 250 and 280 kilometers an hour. And then once your landing's assured, bring the flaps out to the landing position, and you'll slow down to 200 to 210 kilometers per hour. Alright, so we're established on downwind. We're bringing the throttle back to 5,000 RPM to get ourselves slowed up. So around about midfield, we should be below 350 kilometers an hour. You can extend the landing gear. The nose will want to drop a little bit, so you can add some nose up trim if you wanted to, but I wouldn't recommend it because there's a tendency of the airplane to pitch up when you go to the first flap stage. So you're going to beam that touchdown point, set the flaps to takeoff, and then pitch the nose down and maintain between 240 and 280 kilometers per hour in this base to final turn. Now your aiming point will be a little bit in front of the runway, so that's what I'm trying to visualize as I'm making this turn. You don't want to roll out too close to the runway either, as you want to give the airplane a chance to decelerate and slow down to your final approach speed once you get those flaps out. So as we roll out here, coming in a short final, going to get that airplane slowed back. Got the landing made, so flaps out to landing position. You can increase the thrust a little bit if you need to. Just adjust it as needed as you come in. Aiming at the beginning of the runway, you can start bringing the throttle back to idle. Now if they flame out, this is okay. You can just restart them after you land. Hold the nose up to keep the nose wheel off the ground. As soon as you touch down, the nose wheel is going to come down immediately. You'll full back pressure on the yoke, applying the brakes, and you can extend the drogue chute as well. And that'll help you get a shorter landing distance. And you can jettison the drogue chute as you slow down enough. And then just restart the engines if you need to, or just taxi wherever. That'll complete the tutorial for how to fly the Arado 234. So until next time, remember to fly safe and check 6.